So once again, today we are taking up a gate of the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. So everyone recalls this is a piece that shows up in the 11th fascicle of the 12th fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. Mostly it's a long quote from another text called The Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha, so this was not something that Dogen himself actually wrote, but it got included with his writings, and he made some comments about some of the materials in this text and wrote a final paragraph saying something like, please investigate all these gates. Please investigate all these 108 gates. So today we are taking up gate 79, which is about right livelihood. So we've moved into a section of this text on the elements of the Eightfold Path as factors of awakening. So we are up now to right livelihood. So our gate statement for today says, right livelihood is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we get rid of all evil ways. So when this gate refers to all evil ways, it's actually referring to something specific in the Buddhist tradition. So as usual, let's do this in pieces. Let's start by understanding what right livelihood is about, and then let's see how it's related to these evil ways, also known as the unfortunate destinies, right? So let's kind of do this in pieces. So in general, right livelihood means not making a living by things like stealing and gambling and killing and pandering and stuff like that. Things clearly that break the precepts. So these are unwholesome activities in any event, but if the motivation to do them is, for instance, greed, to make money, now we've added a whole layer of trouble. We have trouble on top of trouble and suffering on top of suffering. So the tradition has two sets of teachings about right livelihood, one aimed at householders and the other one aimed at ordained Sangha. So the Buddha says, a lay follower should not engage in 5 types of business. Which 5? Business in weapons, business in human beings, business in meat, business in intoxicants, and business in poison. So elsewhere he says there are 2 other jobs we should avoid, being a soldier and being an actor, which is kind of interesting, right? So soldier, of course, because of the killing involved, right? We can see pretty clearly a connection to a precept there. Acting, because if we're acting on stage or screen or whatever, these days we're stirring up the passions and the emotions and the delusions of the audience. Now, of course, what's interesting about that is by the time we get to Japan, acting, there's a very clear connection between acting and Zen, the way there was a connection between Zen and a lot of other arts. So there's a real shift in this thing, and yet it's not clear. Certainly, when it comes to things like poetry, there's still a debate going on. Is that kind of activity a useful practice, or is it about stirring up emotion and delusion? And all right, so these things are not that clear. And as we're going to see today, almost all of this is just not that clear. So back in the Buddha's day, being an actor was not a good thing. By the time we get to Japan, we've got Zeami and people actually teaching about these things. But overall, the teaching is don't make your living by engaging in breaking precepts yourself, or by encouraging other people or making it possible for other people to break precepts, because it's unwholesome for you and it's unwholesome for others. So again, we have suffering kind of on top of suffering. So, trafficking in weapons enables killing by others, even if you yourself are not doing the killing. Selling drugs creates delusion and suffering for others, even if you yourself are not taking these things. So we can't predict the outcome of our actions. It would be easy to say, well, it's not my fault if people use something I sell them to do some kind of evil thing, to do some kind of harmful thing. But if we really aspire to skillful action, if we really aspire to liberate beings from suffering, then we have to look at our motivation for engaging in a particular kind of activity. And, we can probably guess where things are going to go. If you're selling people guns, what do you use guns for? We can probably predict. So, frequently that motivation is money, it's greed. We'll come back to that in a minute. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So, we need to look not only at what are we doing, but what are we enabling or encouraging others to do? What are we putting out into society and into the world? So there's an additional set of warnings for monks for ordained Sangha. So in the Chichi Shingi, or the Pure Standards for Temple Administrators, Dogen warns the monks that there are 4 wrong livelihoods for us. Right? These come from a commentary on the Parinirvana Sutra, which is attributed to Nagarjuna. So these are actually bigger, bigger than Dogen. So those 4 wrong livelihoods are conveying orders for the national government. In earlier texts, this is more like running errands for lay people. But at the time, there's a lot of unrest. There's 2 centers of government in Japan. Things are going back and forth. Dogen was never terribly interested in engaging with or being recognized by or having relationships with the government. So running things back and forth for the government, not a good thing. Fortune telling or divination by palm reading or by looking at sort of, flocks of birds or lines on the ground or things that come from nature. There were ways to sort of try to predict the future from that. Divination using astrology. And the 4th one is growing grain, growing certain kinds of grain. So that one's a surprise for us, right? Given what we know about East Asian Buddhism and work as a practice. So again, we'll come back to that in a minute, but that one's kind of a surprise. So Dogen says if your food comes to you by means of any of these 4 wrong livelihoods, then you shouldn't eat it. So if you're a monk and you're doing any of these things, you're running errands for people, you're telling fortunes, or you're growing grain, interestingly, you shouldn't eat that food. That's not a way to make your livelihood. So the first wrong livelihood about doing things for the government or for lay people, I think is pointing to a larger teaching about doing things directly with some expectation of reward. So doing something as ordained Sangha with some expectation that you're going to get something directly back. So for instance, if Buddha stopped to give a teaching to a lay person, and then out of gratitude, that layperson, goes into his house and tries to find something special, something nice to offer the Buddha, he wouldn't take it. If he came back and offered him food, Buddha wouldn't eat it because he says, we don't teach for personal gain. We just offer the Dharma without some expectation about getting something back. So, how much more so that monks are not at the beck and call of society for the purpose of gaining some kind of material reward. Supposedly, we left home to concentrate on practice. We could have kept our jobs. We could have kept that life if what we were looking to do was, work in exchange for some kind of reward. So again, this is not clean and clear, even today, right? I mean, I'm staff here, so there's some kind of direct support, right? So motivation becomes important here. So monks also weren't supposed to engage in fortune telling or divination. Well, there's been Buddhist magic, if you will, from the beginning of the tradition. Goes a long way back. So this prohibition goes all the way back to the Buddha, who said these things are debased arts. They're not actually based on seeing reality clearly. He says, I myself would never do them. Right? So he's clearly saying this is, not how monks should be supporting themselves by running around telling fortunes. What's an auspicious day to do this or that, right? So the Pali Canon has pages and pages of the kind of divinations and charms and spells that we're not supposed to engage in, and yet from the beginning of the tradition, it happens anyway, right? So in some cases, it was a way to build a relationship with the local laity. This was something monks could offer to, try to help the local laity or to build some good relationship with them. So monks offered these services as a way of meeting people's need to predict and control their environment. So you can imagine in a place like medieval Japan, where there is war and unrest, there's also, epidemic, famine, fires that are, wiping things out. It's not an easy time to live in, right? There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of unpredictability. So you can imagine, as a layperson who is looking to ordain Sangha, saying, well, these folks have some kind of special abilities, some special powers, they're trained in spiritual practice, they ought to be able to tell me, what's going to happen to me, or to my business, or to my farmland, or my family. So, if you offer that kind of service and you get some kind of contribution for it, a certain kind of relationship develops. But Buddha, Nagarjuna, Dogen say that is not a wholesome way of supporting yourself. If you're chanting a dharani for preventing disaster as part of your practice, as part of your service, you're not getting any payment for it, any food offerings for it directly, that's different. If you're chanting to protect your mountain and nobody's coming up to you afterwards and saying, here's your reward, that's a different thing. Dojo has talked about Daishin Dharani, and what a Dharani is. It's a spell, right? It's a protection spell. We still chant some of these things in our services today. So it's not that we need to eliminate them, but are we doing them in order to get something back directly? That's the issue. So if you're doing these things for money, as a monk, you're also encouraging people to rely on your special powers, whatever they might be, rather than on the practice of actually seeing clearly for yourself, using your own wisdom and compassion and your own practice to see what is happening in reality now, what's this action I need to take, right? So, of course, we would like to encourage people to do their own practice, have their own, rely on their own awakening, rather than going to somebody in a robe and saying, please tell me what to do. So, folks need to make their own decisions, take their own actions based on that. And again, if you're not doing that, you're engaging with lay people in some way that brings a direct reward. So lastly, the admonition against farming. It comes from original Indian teachings, of course, that monks were supposed to rely on alms, not to do any kind of work like this themselves, not to handle money and all of that. By the time Zen moves through China and into Japan, of course, we have work practice. Work practice is important, and it includes farming. Monks are fairly self-sufficient. When I was in the Sunwon Soto, we certainly grew food. We were harvesting our own potatoes out in the field, right? I mean, this becomes a part of our sort of normally accepted practice. So Dogen seems to be okay with sort of accurately quoting this piece from the commentary, even though that's not probably how people were actually living at the time. So I think he's encouraging us to completely think through, what are we doing? How are we supporting ourselves as ordained Sangha? Where is our support coming from? So an important theme here is, are you doing whatever you are doing for a living mainly to get as much wealth back for yourself as possible? So whatever your activity is, what is the motivation behind that? So even if the work itself is not unwholesome, are we carrying it out in some unwholesome way? Are we doing something which appears to be a wonderful, helpful, wholesome livelihood, and doing that with some kind of twisted thinking about what should be happening there? So, are we cheating our customers, underpaying our employees, engaging in illegal business practices, doing some other kinds of ethical stuff, even though the work itself is not an unethical activity? So going back to the Buddha's time, right livelihood also includes sort of what we might call household management. So it's not only how did you make the money, how are you getting the support? What are you doing with it now that you've got it? How are we handling the money now that we've made the money? So the teachings about this vary a little bit between householders and monks who've sort of left home and live in a temple. So the Buddha says, a householder, knowing his income and expenses, leads a balanced life, neither extravagant nor miserly, knowing that thus his income will stand in excess of his expenses, but not his expenses in excess of his income. So he's saying, balance your budget. Don't spend more than you got. Pay attention to the income and the outgo, and make sure you have some stability, that you're financially stable. Uchiyama Roshi says, Sawaki Roshi often said that losing is enlightenment and gaining is delusion. In the ordinary world, the principle is that if expenditures keep increasing, we'll eventually go bankrupt. In Buddha Dharma, we have to become comfortable with the attitude that even if we are bankrupt and live in poverty, we should keep increasing expenditures. Unless we really accept such an attitude, we'll never live a truly wealthy life. In other words, if you wish to be rich, first of all, be poor. In human life, it is very difficult to lower our standard of living once we have enjoyed a materially rich life. So we should not try to raise our standard of living. Rather, we should try to train ourselves to settle in poverty. This is the wealthiest way of life. So Uchiyama often said that he had never been gainfully employed more than a few months in his life. He taught school for, 6 months or something. He said that was the only paycheck he ever got. So he's very much into this life of accepting poverty and not needing too much. He felt it was really important that in his practice he'd be a poor monk. That was like an important part of what his vows were about, or what his practice was about. To accept that situation, to live within that situation, not try to raise his standard of living. So if you have a home and a family, you can't live that way, right? I mean, you got bills to pay, you got people to support, you got kids to feed, right? So to be constantly increasing your expenditure to the point where you can't take care of your life is a problem. But, we can still practice letting go of greed, anger, and ignorance. How are we managing the household? How are we managing the household budget? We can still try to live in a sustainable way that doesn't harm other beings, doesn't harm ourselves, is not based on grasping and clinging and acquisition and and all of that. So all the elements of the Eightfold Path are connected. This we know. So right livelihood does not exist by itself. Of course, it can't exist in isolation from all the other elements of the Eightfold Path. So it's part of the section on ethics, or Shila, which also includes right speech and right action. So those were the last two gates we looked at. So speech, action, livelihood. It's all, what are we doing in the world, right? What's our system of ethics? How are we making decisions on what action we take in the world? But it's also connected to the rest of that wheel, the rest of that element wheel. So Buddha says this all starts with right view. So, and how is right view the forerunner? One discerns wrong livelihood is wrong livelihood, and right livelihood is right livelihood. And what is wrong livelihood? Scheming, persuading, hinting, belittling, and pursuing gain with gain. This is wrong livelihood. One tries to abandon wrong livelihood and to enter into right livelihood. This is one's right effort. One is mindful to abandon wrong livelihood and to enter and remain in right livelihood. This is one's right mindfulness. Thus, these three qualities, right view, right effort, and right mindfulness, run and circle around right livelihood. So, of course, livelihood doesn't just exist by itself. Just like any action we're taking in the world, just like right speech, right? We need to do some discernment. It's connected with how do we see things? Do we see clearly? So first we've got to be able to look at what we're doing with the eyes of Buddha, right? Or with prajna, with wisdom. What are we actually carrying out? We also need to see clearly our motivation and whether what we're doing is wholesome and helpful and skillful or not. And we have to be able to be honest with ourselves about that, right? And admit that. We might have a job that's really going pretty well in terms of bringing in money, but like what else is going on there? And it's not easy to do. And it's sometimes not easy to be honest with ourselves about our motivation. So we need to look clearly at that, and then we actually need to do something about it. So we might have to change our business practices, right? Change our attitude about the job. We might actually have to change careers if we realize what we're doing is not so wholesome, not so healthy. That might not be easy. That takes some courage. It takes some commitment, some real effort to make sure that we're living in an ethical way now, and that we don't backslide when things get tough. Well, for a little while, I'm going to try to do this ethically, but when this gets too hard, I'm going to go back to my old habits. So, that's why we practice the entire Eightfold Path and not just the elements that we kind of pick and choose. Today, I'm going to think about right livelihood, It's right. It's why this whole Eightfold thing is distinct but not separate. We need all the elements of the path. Livelihood is complicated, right? Livelihood involves relationships with other people, and what we say and what we think and how we view the world and all of that. So, other half of the gate statement. Right livelihood is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we get rid of all evil ways. So the evil ways, or the three unfortunate destinies, or the three unfortunate paths, animals, hungry ghosts, and existence in hell. So those should sound familiar, right? You might recognize those as the three lower realms of the Rokudo, or the 6 realms of samsara through which we transmigrate. So a quick review, those 6 realms are heavenly beings, human beings, fighting gods, animals, hungry ghosts, hell realms. So the concept of the Rokudo, or the 6 realms of samsara, goes back to pre-Buddhist India. It's part of the beliefs about transmigration and rebirth, and that what you do in this life determines where you end up in the next one, where you're born in the next life. And this happens over and over and over again. There's a reason this thing is a wheel. It goes around and around and around. So Buddhism picks up this idea and teaches that all living beings are born into one of these 6 realms of samsara, or states of existence. We're all kind of trapped on this wheel in whatever one of those 6 places we are, going around and around and around, until we can liberate ourselves from desire and suffering and unwholesomeness and sort of leap free from this wheel. So each rebirth in samsara, which realm we end up in, depends on the actions in this life. What are we doing now determines where we end up next time. So the lowest 3 states are called the 3 evil paths, or the 3 bad states, or the 3 unfortunate destinies. And this is what the gate statement is referring to as all evil ways. If you go back and look at the kanji, this is what it's actually talking about. So the animal realm is characterized by stupidity and servitude. It includes livestock. So, you're driving your oxen with your cart. So, animals are driven by impulse, or driven by instinct, and they prey on each other because they're animals. So this is not a fun place to be. Hungry ghost realm is where we experience eternal craving and starvation, and sometimes we never have enough of food or whatever. Sometimes these ghosts are said not to have a body. Sometimes they have bodies, but they have very small mouths and very large stomachs. So it's quite a graphic representation of this just constant craving, right? You know, you have a big stomach you need to fill, but you have this very tiny mouth and a very tiny throat, and you can just sort of never quite take in enough. So somehow these beings are always extremely thirsty and extremely hungry and unhappy. So you get there, you get to that realm because of your greed and clinging and right in your life, grasping in your life. There's some difference opinion about which is worse, the hungry ghost realm or the animal realm. But in any case, that's not a place you want to be. Neither of those is a place you want to be, no matter which one is worse. So beings in hell are in the lowest possible realm. They're in the worst possible situation. They experience this constant sort of torture and aggression. And again, you get there because of lying, stealing, adultery, right? Bad stuff. I've said before, you know, the Japanese are the masters of hell realms. There's like 1 million hells. There's hot hells and cold hells, and I mean, there's just like hells. So they're very good at hells and painting about hells. There's a lot of hells. So you know, it's not just one big hell. There's many, many, many different ones depending on your circumstances. So you know, each one has a different kind of suffering. So in some there's intense heat, in some there's intense cold, in some you're eaten alive. I mean, you know, anything you can imagine, there's a hell for that. So in the Mahayana, and for us today, these 6 realms tend to be taken more as mind states than as actual places of rebirth. So the going around and around on the wheel, we can see what's happening here. You know, we notice our mind state changes, our attitude changes. We're in hell 1 minute, something good happens. We're in the heavenly beings the next minute. We're hungry, we're driven by impulse, right? So we're going around and around all the time. So you don't end up in one of these places for eternity. This is not like Western religion where, you know, you're sent to a place of hell and you're there forever and ever. You're moving around. There's transmigration. So there's some opportunity to not be in that hell realm forever, or that animal realm, or that hungry ghost realm. When you've used up your evil karma, you get reborn somewhere else on the wheel and you get to start again, right? You get another chance. So the place you want to end up, of course, ultimately, is the human realm. It's not the heavenly beings. It's the human realm, because the human realm is the only place where we can practice and wake up and be liberated from our delusion and our suffering and sort of leap free from this wheel, if you will, right? So the fact that we're born in this human realm is supposed to be pretty auspicious. We actually have the chance to see clearly and wake up and sort of let go of the craving, the aversion, right, the poisons. We can't do that when we're in these 3 unfortunate destinies. Animals can't do it. Hungry ghosts can't do it. If you're in the hell realm, you're so caught up with your suffering and torture, you certainly can't do it. So this is our opportunity. So clearly the 3 unfortunate destinies are manifestations of the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance, right? We can quite directly see the relationship there. If you're greedy, you end up in the realm of hungry ghosts. And if you're angry, you end up in the hell realm. And if you're ignorant, you go to the animal realm. And so, right, very clear connections there. So what does this have to do with right livelihood? Well, pretty simple, right? Right livelihood requires us to take some kind of action. And if that action and our motivation is based on one of these 3 poisons, then we end up in an unfortunate place, right? We end up with an unfortunate destiny. So it really reinforces that it's not just what we're doing, but why we're doing it that's important. The why we're doing it can send us to one of the 3 unfortunate destinies, even if what we're doing is not an evil thing. So in the Pali Canon, there's a story of a monk who became really good at medicine and treating the sick. You know, he became quite a skilled doctor. Sounds like a good thing, right? He's out there relieving suffering, curing illness. But one day, a grateful patient gives him some kind of really elegant, expensive food item, some kind of grateful thank you. This monk gets all excited about it. This is a really nice thing to have, whatever it is. He runs to his friend Shariputra, and he shows him what he's got. And he tells the story of how this came to be, what a great thing this is. He offers to share his food with Shariputra. And Shariputra just looks at him, doesn't say anything, turns his back on him and walks away. And you would think, well, he's offering to share this wonderful thing with his friend. What's going on? Well, of course, Shariputra is disgusted with this monk because he's so caught up in this kind of greed, even though he was doing good action and the action was rewarded. This healing of suffering was rewarded by somebody who was grateful. Immediately, this monk kind of lost it and got really caught up in his delusion. And Shariputra's going, what are you doing? And don't share that with me, right? It's like, just don't include me in your delusion. So, not so simple, not so easy. So, we can start by choosing a livelihood that brings wholesomeness into the world, brings skillful action into the world, rather than the opposite. That takes some discernment, right? We don't just do that discernment one time. Because we're transmigrating all the time, our attitude changes, we learn things, we become wiser, we become tired, we become whatever. We're constantly doing this discernment. Is what I'm doing a wholesome good thing or not? Is my attitude toward this a wholesome attitude or not? We do it again and again and again as part of our practice, right? We sit down on the cushion. We start letting go of thought. We start to see clearly, maybe this thing I'm doing, not so good. Or maybe my attitude about this part of my work is not so good. Or maybe I'm clinging to something about my work. What's going on there? So it's not the discernment that just comes when we sign the contract, right? There's this constant thinking about how am I practicing in the world? So really not easy, right? Really hard sometimes. We might be in a pretty good situation, and yet there's something down here and going, but this company I work for makes something that's not so good or operates in some way that I don't feel okay about it. It's tough to leave that situation. So, maybe we leave it, maybe we change it. But that discernment is this constant part of our practice. So, making mistakes about that, clinging, avarice, sends us to the realm of hungry ghosts. We can't ever have enough sometimes. How about anger? Probably nobody takes a job out of anger. I'm really angry, so I'm going to take this job. Probably not. But we could argue that, of course, some jobs perpetuate violence in various ways. There's obvious ways and there's less obvious ways. So Buddha says, don't be a soldier, but I know people who are Buddhist military. There are chaplains, Buddhist chaplains in the military. So, this is an unfolding story. The answers aren't so clear. Buddha also says don't be an arms dealer, because weapons are about killing. Weapons are about creating harm. You could extend that to don't sell recreational fishing equipment or don't sell insecticide or something, right? But what if farmers using the insecticide are growing more crops to feed hungry people? It's not so clear. It's not so obvious. No clear answers. That discussion could go on and on and on and on and on, right? What if that gun I sold you is for self-defense? Well, not obvious, right? Not easy. Mistakes about livelihood based on anger or based on violence send us to the hell realm. But it's not so easy how that happens. Not so clear how that happens. So then, of course, there's ignorance. Livelihood based on ignorance encourages people to take action based on their sort of lower instincts, baser instincts, right? For animals, including humans, the most basic instinct is survival and reproduction, right? So animals want to avoid death and pass on their genes. I mean, that's what they're doing. It's survival of the individual. It's also survival of the species. So those things aren't bad. Goodness knows we wouldn't be here if those things weren't in play. But what happens when we harm others in order to survive and pass on our genes, whatever that means for us, right? I make sure I have all the food, clothing, and shelter I need, or I think I need, regardless of whether or not you have enough. Or, I don't understand where suffering comes from, so I elbow you out of the way to get whatever I think I need to make sure I'm okay and that I don't have suffering, right? We see this happening all the time. So there's a real element of self-involvement or selfishness, I think, that goes with ignorance, right? As soon as we understand where suffering comes from, we're kind of able to let go of our self-clinging a little bit. So there are a lot of ways to be selfish in the workplace, I think, even if the job or the career is a wholesome career. I mean, I spent decades working for the government. I worked in offices before I did this. I know. We see that happening all the time. So we make mistakes based on ignorance. We end up in the animal realm of this set of unfortunate destinies. So, right livelihood is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we get rid of all evil ways. So, well, as we can see, this whole livelihood thing, its relationship to three poisons, its relationship to the precepts is pretty complicated. So, how do we consider what livelihood we ought to take up. We can think about our karmic circumstances, which includes what we're good at and what we enjoy doing. It's probably no good to aspire to do something wonderful that we're just really not suited for, right? I mean, my father's a doctor. He would have been thrilled if I had also gone into medicine. Well, I am no good at chemistry, I'm here to tell you. That would have been suffering for me and for everybody. You know, not something I was well suited to do. I was much better suited to a career in communications. So I've tried to do that in a way which was wholesome. So even within a career, there are, of course, different ways to participate in any particular field. If you're a doctor, are you better suited to research or, you know, to direct patient care? Are you a diagnostician? Are you a surgeon? Are you a pathologist? You know, what are you? Where do you best, where do you make the best use of your karmic circumstances? How do you best be a bodhisattva in that world? It's not separate from practice. So there's nothing wrong with doing some discernment about what am I best able to offer, right? So each set of 5 skandhas is unique. Each one of us is unique. That's fine. You know, we're going to be more skilled at some things than at other things. So how do we make sure that that livelihood is a bodhisattva activity that we can actually carry out? So we consider our bodhisattva vows, our practice of the Eightfold Path, our work with precepts. How well does what we're doing fit with those teachings and that guideline? And, you know, what's our motivation for taking it up? Is our motivation for taking it up based in 3 poisons? And, you know, can we see what's going on there? So maybe we're motivated by greed. Maybe we choose the career because the career itself is lucrative, or maybe we just do the job in such a way that we're just getting everything we can for ourselves. You know, how much can I take from this company? How much can I take from this organization? Are there freebies that I can sort of help myself? Greed might be for money, but it might be for power. It might be for fame. It might be for something else. The biggest office, the most recognition, the best promotion, you know, whatever that is. There's clinging in there, right? So whatever we're grasping and clinging to related to our livelihood, we have to be careful, I think, about not confusing that kind of greed with aspiration. I can aspire to get additional training to do this job in the best possible way. That might be aspiration and not necessarily greed and clinging, right? But it's really subtle. It's really subtle. So we've really got to pay attention to, you know, what's my motivation here? And of course, it's probably not pure. If I get the training, I get the promotion, and probably I get more money. But is that the primary reason, right? So it can be pretty difficult to distinguish the desire to do the best job we can from the desire to get something for me. So this is where we have to do some really honest discernment. And that result is often a mixed result. It's not entirely self-clinging, and it's not entirely not self-clinging, because that's the human condition. So in order to do the best job I can, you know, I need more staff, but having more staff makes me more important. Back and forth, back and forth. So are we in it for the money, even though we hate the job or we hate the career? Now we're not talking about doing something that isn't your dream job because you need to feed your family, or you need to pay for your education. We've all been in that circumstance. I certainly have. You know, I've taken jobs that were just jobs because I needed to pay the rent. I'm not talking about that. We're talking about craving and greed for some kind of a luxurious lifestyle, expensive stuff, social status, you know, all of that. Actions that feed the ego, actions that encourage this kind of clinging. So even though I hate the job, I get enough of a salary that I can buy the expensive house and I can have the pretty clothes and all that stuff. You know, I'm getting something back from that. So the bottom line is, are we harming others in order to get what we want? Are we perpetuating suffering for, you know, our own gain in some way? There will probably always be some element of self-clinging, even in a job that does good in the world. You know, there are not many human actions that are completely pure in that way. So our motivations can be mixed, and we have to make decisions and take responsibility for the outcomes and just be clear about what we're seeing. Do the best we can do moment by moment. It's not as easy as saying just, well, if I choose the right livelihood, then I'm guaranteed to stay out of those 3 unfortunate destinies. If I can just find the right job, then I'm never going to fall into a hell realm or a hungry ghost realm or an animal realm. It'd be great if it was that easy, but we know from our practice nothing's that easy, right? There's always multiple things happening, multiple streams of sort of karmic circumstance are happening there. But, you know, just because we spend so much of our time and energy and attention and ego being in the workplace, it's a huge place of practice. Not only do we spend hours and hours there, but even when we're at home, we're thinking about the job, right? So, I mean, it's just this huge part of our lives. it's a great place to practice. It brings everything together. Sometimes the biggest challenges we have, maybe not on the cushion. It might be that coworker we just don't get along with, or these circumstances, these deadlines, or whatever we're facing in the job. So if we're not taking our practice to work, I think somehow we've missed the connection between practice and the rest of our lives. We practice with our families, we practice with our health, we practice with multiple areas of our lives. We can't leave work out of that. We can't leave livelihood out of that. So, where are there more chances for becoming annoyed or trying to get ahead or feeling satisfaction when we've helped somebody else? I mean, all the elements of our lives, all the things that enter into our mind state, our attitude, right? Right there on the job, that whole daily human experience. Right there in the middle of that. So do I feel good about what I'm doing to support myself? Do I feel good about the way I'm doing that work? Do I feel okay about the circumstances in which I work? What's expected of me? What are the people around me doing and saying? Right? Because that's a huge influence on us. Even if the job is fine, are the circumstances toxic? What am I taking in every day? Just being in the workplace, is that okay? Is that, what I want to fill my mind with, my heart with? And is it influencing the way I behave in the world? Am I starting to take on things that I wish I wasn't taking on? So, if things aren't going well there, what can I do about it? Well, are there teachings that I can remember when I'm encountering that negative coworker or that questionable business practice, or, I'm going to get carried away by delusion and unskillful actions of body, speech, and mind? Are there some teachings, something Buddha said or something that I can remember? Kind of keep me on track. How can I bring both wisdom and compassion to work and see what's going on with me and with others, right? So not just the wisdom, but also the compassion. Are people around me suffering? And are they causing other people to suffering? And is that sort of lapping over onto me? So we don't have to wear our rock suits to work. We don't have to evangelize for Buddha at the copy machine, right? We don't have to be obvious about what we're doing. And in fact, if you do that, people won't like it, right? Nobody likes to be preached at in the office, so please don't do that. I've actually worked in a place where the Buddhists were evangelizing, and it wasn't a Buddhist place. People didn't like it, so don't push it on people. There are teachable moments in your job and with your coworkers, but it's about what you're embodying. It's not about Buddha says, or I went to Sesshin last week and I learned this thing. It's like, nobody cares. Probably. If they ask you, okay, tell them about your practice, but that's not what you're there to do. There's an awful lot we can carry just by carrying, right? Just by embodying the vows and the practice. And it brings something, I think, interesting to the workplace. So, we can bring that practice to work in a very quiet way, in a very subtle way. It's the ground of our own life and activity. If that's the ground of how we are in the world and how we're behaving in the work that we're doing and what we're offering in the world, we can't not bring it to work because it's like who we are, right? But in my experience, if we move through the world, with this sort of quiet, steady bodhisattva presence, we kind of provide a refuge for people. There's kind of an oasis there of something in the middle of a busy, chaotic workplace. There's a lot of stress, people on deadline, doing and saying things that maybe aren't 100% skillful. There's something about bringing our aspiration to do something else into that circumstance that enables others to do it too. Oh, there's another way to be in the workplace. I don't have to be like this toxic thing that's happening, or I don't have to be like this stressful thing that's happening. I used to get people coming into my office and just sitting down because I, kept my office fairly minimal. I tried to be a steady presence. It wasn't that I was counseling people necessarily, but more than one person would come into my office and go, oh, it's just so peaceful in here, right? So, I don't think that was me. I think that was just some steadiness that came from practice. So I didn't have to say anything to people about what I was doing. But I think we can offer that in the workplace in helpful ways, which are not overt, right? They're not pushy. People, I think, if they encounter you in the workplace and you are that steady presence, if you have that sort of stillness in the midst of this whirling thing, people get something from you, but they don't know what it is and they don't know why, which is really okay, right? If they really feel like, oh, if so-and-so is here, if Sawyer's here, if Doju's here, oh, things are going to be okay, right? It's not that you have all the answers. It's that there's a calmness there, which is helpful because it allows other people to be calm. Sometimes I think we have to be frantic, we have to be stressed, otherwise we're not important enough, we don't have enough to do. Somebody's going to say, oh, you're not working hard enough. Why? We can take on what we're doing in a very steady, calm, bodhisattva way, still get the thing done, do it with wisdom and compassion, not lose our minds. So if we can do that, it enables other people to do that in a very interesting kind of way. At least, that's my experience. So let's do the right job. Let's do the job right. So what would you like to say about right livelihood, how we support ourselves, practice in the workplace, whatever comes to you about this particular Dharma gate? I'm going to start with people here because I can see you, and then I'm going to ask Doju to facilitate people at home. Anything from people in the room? Sawyer, then Sagan, then Mario. Yes, yes, and yes. Okay, please.
Yeah, I guess my question is sort of about stability. In terms of thinking of livelihood as what supports our life, our livelihood, and then our life being sort of the support of our practice. So that livelihood is this very kind of foundational collection of actions and whatever that supports our ability to practice. That's kind of a simplifying sense. What supports our ability to practice? And thinking of my own, the last maybe 5 or 6 years is kind of like bouncing around between different jobs, which are part of livelihood, not the whole thing, but bouncing between, substitute teaching and conservation work and internships, and there's this kind of like unsteadiness in that experience of bouncing around. And yet I also think of, Kodo Sawaki as homeless Kodo. His practice was very much built upon almost bouncing around and not becoming attached to some sort of settled circumstance. And so when I feel now kind of a real sense, it would be nice to settle into something, and that would, to be able to support my practice with a steady job, And so I'm wondering about that tension between steadiness and then also like, the constant discernment that's involved in that. There's no rest, but there's also rest. And what's that with livelihood?
Sure. Well, of course, it can feel kind of unrooted, if you're changing your job every 6 months or something like that. And yet there's a constant there, right? And the constant is, what's the attitude toward work? So all we have is this moment anyway. The only place we can take action is this moment. So the only job I can do is this job. I can't do the ones I've done. I can't do the ones I'm going to do. This is it. So there is a steadiness about bringing that approach, right? Bringing that attitude. This is the only thing I can do right now. And yet, the human condition is sometimes we'd like to settle down and stop moving. And it would be nice to go to a job where I've done this job for 15 years. I know the job, I know the people, I know the expectations. Doesn't mean there isn't creative growth in the job, but so I think there is some creative tension there. I think both of those circumstances can be wholesome. I think as we get older, we'd like to settle a bit, right? We'd like to stop sort of bouncing around a little bit. I didn't do a lot of job bouncing until I got older, and then I had to get used to that, right? Because I'd been in the same job for 15, 16 years, and suddenly, I went to Japan, and then I was in Milwaukee, and then I was in Minnesota, and now I'm here. I've never lived like that. So that was a new thing for me. But I think whatever the job is, we bring a certain attitude to that, which says, this is what I'm doing right now. So for all intents and purposes, I've been here forever, I'm going to be here forever, now is all I've got. Right? So I think both of those approaches are okay, but where do we find the stability in the midst of it? So the stability can come from, I've been here a long time, but the stability can also come from, I'm settled in my practice, in my wisdom and compassion. And that's the stability that I'm bringing to the job, right? If that's the case, then on the very first day, you're coming in with stability, which is an interesting practice too. Right? I don't know anything about this. I don't know the people. I don't know how to do the job, but I'm still coming in with groundedness. So I think we don't have to feel like we're sort of out there with a lifeline. But of course, having a settled situation is helpful. That's nice. There's some anxiety we can let go of if we have that kind of settled circumstance. Of course, you're there long enough, there are things you stop seeing, right? There are things we start taking for granted. We kind of get stuck. So sometimes a little change is a good thing. So I don't think there's a good and bad about that. I think it's just whatever our karmic circumstances are in this moment, what do we bring to that? Because now is all I've got. So I have to do the job that's in front of me right now. So it's another case where there's no easy answer, right? I think I saw you next.
Yeah, I think maybe you've already addressed the question that I had as I was listening. But, I was wondering, we tend to consider the evil realms as something we want to avoid. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about, a bodhisattva being willing to go to those realms to kind of accompany beings and try to show a way out. I mean, I think you talked about it in terms of being an oasis to people around us. But I wonder if you have anything more you would say about that.
Well, certainly in our tradition, Jizo goes down into the hell realms, right? Jizo goes into hell to liberate beings. So there are ways that perhaps we can come alongside, is the pastoral term, come alongside people who are suffering. So somebody who's in a hell realm, can we come alongside that person and offer some kind of peace or advice or something to help that person move through that kind of suffering. So we can go into those realms with people in such a way that we're helping them, I think, without needing to carry something unwholesome ourselves, do something unwholesome ourselves. We can get there without being sort of cast in there because of our own greed, anger, and ignorance, right? I think there's a difference between coming alongside somebody in a hell realm or an animal realm or a hungry ghost realm and trying to help liberate that person from suffering, right? So it's a good point. I think if we're sort of cast ourselves into a hell realm because of our own three poisons, it's very difficult for us to see clearly. We can't help ourselves, let alone help anybody else, right? So to be that bit of calm in a workplace or in family or whatever, we can open up that little bit of space for somebody to sort of settle a bit, see clearly. I think that's how we help people move themselves out of those hell realms. So in some ways, that might be the important thing we're doing by bringing the stability, right? If we are stable ourselves, other people can feel like they can sort of, it's like we're a shade tree and come sit under the shade tree, right? And feel safe. There's something we can bring with our stability and our groundedness and our wisdom and compassion that makes people feel safe. And if they feel safe and they're not constricted and defensive and stressed, their own sort of natural prajna can take hold a little bit, right? So by extending that bit of compassion to somebody, we can redirect them to their own wisdom where they can come to some clarity about what needs to happen. Is this a wholesome situation or not, right? So I think that's part of the refuge. I think that's part of the oasis, right? Which, as bodhisattvas, it doesn't mean we're out there, saying, well, Buddha says this or this. It's just like, I'm the shade tree. Somebody can sit under the shade tree and get a little respite, We don't have to be clergy to do that. I think we do that for each other just as bodhisattvas. You want to say some things about that?
Well, no, that's fine, but I have one other quick question. I think earlier in your talk, you had mentioned about acting, and you mentioned some kind of Japanese form of acting, and then in passing.
Oh, I threw it out. So the guy I mentioned was a guy named Zeami. Zeami, Zeami, was a well-known actor in, I want to say, are you familiar with him? Okay, it's 16th or 17th century, so it's not Dogen's time. It's much later than that. So acting, you learned acting the way you learned a lot of the other kind of arts. You know, you kind of apprenticed yourself. It was a family. There's a reason that we talk about like Dharma family and Dharma brothers. This is all that the whole system was like that. So all the arts were kind of the same way. There was a parental figure, and then there were brothers and sisters, you know, learning. So you learned the same way. So he did a lot of writing. He wrote manuals about this, and you could see the sort of Zen practice that underlies it. So there was, you know, he wrote quite a bit about what you actually carry on the stage, and you have to learn to manifest this thing in a very subtle kind of way. So yeah, there was a whole, you can read about him. He's a really interesting guy. When you read about that sort of intersection of Zen practice and acting, it's a whole really interesting mixture, right? And yet at the same time, you know, of course, there's the argument that says all of that is delusion. All of that is feeding people's delusion, and is that really a good thing to do? But he really took it on, you know, in a way that sounds very much to us like how we practice, right? A lot of discernment about what are you manifesting, and you have to get clear yourself before you can take on a character and truly, you know, manifest what's happened. So anyway, that was the passing reference. Yeah, there are books about him you can read about him. The whole interesting thing. That goes back to my grad school days. Was there somebody else in the room who had a comment? Mark, did I see your hand up?
Kind of not. There's so many things that, you know, that bring up ideas and comments. The one thing that I just, when thinking about right livelihood and practice and taking your practice into work, the only thing that I've really found that it really does is it helps me identify the stress a lot quicker.
Yep.
To where it's like, it doesn't get rid of the stress. It's like, yeah, this is a stressful situation. Shit, I'm not going to get any sleep for a week. Okay. All right, until this project is done. And that's it. That is a benefit too, because when you're in the middle of the stress, and if you don't realize you're in the middle of the stress, it's never ending. At least this way you see that you're in the stress, and you see, well, it will end when the project ends, so I'll be okay. It's not that big of a deal. So in that sense, the hell realm is temporary. I think a really good discernment factor in looking for right livelihood is thinking about your job. If you lose it, what are you know, it's the most stressful thing that you can do these days is lose your job. You know, well, not lose it, you know where it is, it's just some other guy's doing it. So what would you lose if you lost your job? What would you want? What would you want to keep if you lost your job? And I think that is something very important to look at in discernment. For like, you know, personally me, I see a lot of greed in there because I'm finally able to save a lot of money, and I don't want to stop that. It's a nice thing not having to live paycheck to paycheck. And it's not that I'm buying extravagant things. I can, but I don't have to. But it's still, I don't want to give up that paycheck. So I think losing, you know, the exercise of going through the loss of your job would help in discernment of right livelihood.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because of course it's not just the paycheck, it's the ego boost, it's the identity. Who am I if I don't get up in the morning to go to work? Who am I if I don't have people reporting to me? You know, is it, if I've lost my job, is it some condemnation of my skill set? I mean, there's just all this stuff. So yeah, it's really interesting when I think about, you know, what happens if I lose my job, then I also think about, yeah, what things am I attached to? Right? And that's not a, you know, I mean, that's the human condition. And, you know, wanting to save money is not a bad thing, and wanting to use your skills is not a bad thing, and the human condition is we want to be liked and admired and respected by people, and you know, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's, are we harming people with it? You know, do we see it clearly, and are we doing something unwholesome with that, right? But yeah, that's a very helpful piece of discernment, isn't it? Because we don't necessarily, until the pink slip comes, we don't necessarily know, you know, which pieces of that would be painful if I lost them. Excuse me. Anything else in the room? Dojo, we got, because you can see better than I do, have we got people?
I think if anyone can just speak up.
Okay. Anyone at home? Comment, question, reflection?
Hey Hoko, this is Fusats. I really appreciated the question, the conversation on Right Livelihood. It's something even, even if you think you're lined up with your livelihood, you think you're right. It kind of goes in and out because there's on a daily or moment by moment basis, you're having to use discernment to be like, oh, am I working for the benefit of other? Or am I working for the benefit of corporate? Or it's constantly something that I work with, consistently, even being in healthcare, because you see a lot of the decisions the corporations are really, in the end, it's something to ask yourself constantly, like, is that really right livelihood? But at the end of the day, what I find very helpful is, my own personal intent. Can you kind of speak? I think you went into that a little bit about when you were answering Sawyer's question, and about how do you approach what you're doing, whatever you're doing, and with what intention. That, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, and of course, if the corporation doesn't do what it needs to do to survive, you don't have a job. So, right, again, it's not clean and obvious. So, from the outside, we can say, oh, this corporation, it's a greedy corporation. It's, getting everything it can for itself. Well, if it's not doing that, it's going to start firing people, letting people go. So, it's not clean, it's not obvious. So this moment by moment attention, this moment by moment remembering that work is also practice, I think shifts our view about work. When I was working for the government, and I thought, what would happen if I treated this work as practice? What would happen if I was considering the work I was doing was enabling regional services for people, who live in this 7-county metro area. I was not in Indiana at the time. It shifts my thinking about what I'm doing. It really becomes kind of bodhisattva activity. So if ultimately I'm serving the people of my region, it's not a huge step then to think, well, I'm in an interesting way serving the people that I'm working with. So I was, being a communications person, my clients were internal. So I started thinking about my clients in that way too. So these were my coworkers, but I was providing them something, right? So it allows you to bring that sort of perspective to work. So it's not just about I'm working for the boss. It's like, well, there's a larger picture here. So if I really intentionally treat my work as practice, then I have the same attitude toward sending that email or writing that report or making that presentation that I do if I was the tenzo in the kitchen cooking food to support people sitting sesshin, right? Or if I was taking care of this temple so that people had a zendo to sit in, right? It's not different. That attitude can be the same thing. I'm taking care of my work the way I would take care of my practice. I'm taking care of my coworkers the way I take care of my sangha. These people are my work sangha, if you will, right? So, it really shifts how we think about what we're doing when we get up every day. So if we feel okay about getting up in the morning and coming to the zendo, good. What if, when we were getting up to go to work, we had the same kind of attitude? I'm going there to do my practice. It's called work practice. I'm going there to see my sangha. It's my work sangha. Wow, right? It's a big shift, and I find it very helpful. Satsu, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I find that very helpful. Again, it's just, as I've evolved in my practice and kind of gotten older, you start to see that, whatever you're doing, and especially when people, whether it's picking up the trash or picking up, it's in whatever you do, you're bringing that certain intention to your job and to your practice. So I feel like it's so important, Hoko, to just again just kind of reflect back into everything that we're doing. The email is a great example. That's something that I've noticed has changed for me over time. Whereas before I would try to get it out quickly and then just not be thinking about what I'm doing, whereas that may have actually caused more harm than me trying to just get it done. So I think you're exactly right. It's the intention in every single action we do, work, home, personal, etc. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, it's like, who am I serving? I've got to be serving somebody. Who am I serving at this moment? And it's probably, it's not always clear, and we don't always have a face to put on it. But like, I'm putting something out there. So like, who's receiving that? How is it being received? Am I communicating in a way that people can take in what I'm saying, or am I just sort of ranting and raving? Am I doing this quickly to get it done? If we think about work as practice, it changes. And I think, why are we different people in the Zendo than we are in the office? Are we different people in the Zendo than we are in the office? If we are, what's happening there? Why is there a shift? Other people at home? Oh, I think that's Carla up there in the corner.
Yeah. Yep. Good eye. Good eye.
It's not easy.
Thank you for this talk, and I think building on what you just responded to Fusatsu with is what I have found to be a real hurdle and barrier, which is, and I apologize if I've brought this up before because it seems like I have, but in our culture, we are so baked into competing. So this idea of competition that's kind of just there. It's invisible and it's always kind of there because we're sort of brought up on it, and fed it from an early time. And when you actually actually just come right out and just say, well, like, I'm not competing, I'm just wanting to be sort of part of the team, people are often like taken aback. And I know, like, in my career for what I had been doing, it was really contradictory, because on the one hand, we couldn't get our job done without cooperating, and yet on the other hand, the culture was like Shark Tank competitive. And so it was this mismatch, and it was crazy. And I just think being aware of that is a good way to practice, of like, am I competing right now? Like, is this about winning and losing, or is it just about doing the job right? And one of the vows of Samantabhadra is, what is it? I will rejoice in the virtues and happiness of all beings, which is, you know, kind of radical, and so I find that, sort of those two concepts have really helped me with Right Livelihood, which is something that I have really, really struggled with for a long time. So anyway, so thank you for this talk.
Well, there's some really creative tension in the intersection, right? Because there's some kinds of competition. I mean, yes, there's some clinging there, but we compete for scholarships, we compete for grant funding, we compete, right? And so, in a way, we can say, well, that kind of competition furthers the wholesome work that I'm doing, and yet there's some competition. So I think, to come back to the kinds of things that Sagan was raising, is it possible in that circumstance to just demonstrate that there's another way to be? Sometimes the assumption is, I'm going to get whatever I can and elbow people out of the way because I have to do that because there's no other option. Well, maybe if we're creative, there's another option. Is there a way to compete? And I'm sorry, is there a way to cooperate? And if we have to compete, are we competing in this really kind of personal, greedy way, or are we just accepting that in some parts of our jobs there's competition? We've all got ideas. We would love to carry out 1 million beneficial projects, and yet there's only so much funding. The budget's only so big. So somebody's not going to get their project funded. Well, if my project doesn't get funded, can I, as you just said, wish for the benefit and the well-being of the people whose project did get funded and help make that happen? That's not easy to do. The human condition being what it is. Golly, I'm angry. I didn't get my project funded, So I think you're right that awareness about what's happening is sometimes the only thing we feel like we can do in that circumstance. Can I at least be aware that I'm responding to this in a particular way, so I'm not perpetuating suffering, so I'm not sort of prolonging this kind of unwholesomeness? Those aren't easy situations. I'm not here to say The Buddha had all the answers for every circumstance. You know, it's a moment by moment discernment. But I think the discernment and the awareness is the key thing, right? Even if we don't feel steady, can we at least be paying attention to why we don't feel steady? Not easy stuff.
Well, it's a good thing. It's a good thing to think about it and to have that discernment, because that Shark Tank competitiveness is a lot of the karma that we just grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
If you have the ability just to step back just for a second, you have that ability to see where you are.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing to have.
Absolutely, because we fall into habituated thinking. I am going around me is competing, therefore I have to compete. Well, really? Is there another way? Maybe there's another way. So yeah, that habituated thinking just keeps pulling us back into those three unfortunate destinies. So we have a chance to do something else. Great, but that's got to start with right view, right concentration, right effort. Other things from folks at home?
I had a
Please, Dojo, yes.
Well, one thing just related to that, I remember reading recently, was a non-Buddhist person, but just sort of writing about, competitiveness in our culture and the sort of capitalist drive to always have more. And he had this phrase, I refuse to succeed, which I really liked.
I refuse to succeed. What a great phrase.
Because, success is like the thing that I think drives all of this in some way. And it's a more kind of, vacuous term, I guess, that a lot of this stuff can fit into. So I like that. But I was going to ask you, because I think every priest, understands this a little differently. So you started your talk with this split between right livelihood for lay people versus priests. And, of course, in Japanese Buddhism nowadays, there isn't really much to mark the difference between the two. And so I guess my question is just for you, how do you, because some people, I think, say that we should maybe try to be more like different from lay people, and other people are just like, no, a priest is kind of essentially the same as a lay person, maybe just more devoted. So I'm curious how you think of that.
Yeah, well, of course, that line gets blurred, right, for us, because we're sort of householding ordained clergy. I own a house. I got cats who are my dependents, right? So, I got a mortgage payment to make like everybody else does. So, of course, in the early days, you left home and you really left home. And you relied on, the alms and the lay people to support you, and you weren't you gave up your role in society. So you weren't supporting a family, you weren't paying a mortgage, you weren't running a business, you were only doing, Sangha life. So on the one hand, it's a little weird to be staff wearing this stuff. And I had to kind of think about it, because this isn't the first paid Dharma job I've ever had. So you kind of have to think about that. And so, and actually I was doing my own discernment when I was rereading these things from Buddha that says, we don't give the Dharma to get a material reward, we just give the Dharma to give the Dharma. So I kind of think if I was only in front of you giving Dharma talks, I would feel a little funny about being staff. My boss is sitting here. The chair of the board is sitting in front of me. So, and we're going to have a board meeting tonight, and I suspect all this is going to come up again. I would feel a little weird about that, I think. But because my job here encompasses other stuff, other kind of program admin, other kind of planning work, other kinds of things, I feel like that's the piece that gets compensated. Whereas if somebody, I get invitations to do outside speaking, and I don't say, sure, I'll be happy to do that, and here's my bill. They may or may not give me anything, but I still feel like, give the Dharma freely, because that's what you're bound to do. And I kind of feel like even just moving through the world, this is what we're about to do, is give the Dharma freely. So there's always, this is an old question, which, people that I know in robes and I have been talking about this for decades. It's like, at what point do you say, well, if you can't support teachers, then Dharma teaching can't happen? Should there be some kind of acknowledged, recognized, what do I want to say, consistent, financial support for Dharma teachers, and on the other hand, it goes all the way back to the beginning of the tradition that we give the Dharma freely and we don't expect a reward. So that's another area that's kind of a conundrum. I think in the West, many of us work for nonprofits. Our temples are nonprofits. I mean, the same in Japan. It's a religious juridical person is the way they actually, So we have a corporation, which is a body, right? So I mean, there's some kind of organization there, and they support the teacher. So I think for a lot of us that work for a nonprofit corporation, there's an assumption that somehow there's some at least support, But I think we have to be careful about it as teachers, because we can feel that we need a promotion or that we need more money or that this or that, and at the same time, we're in front of the Sangha every week saying, open your hand, let go of greed, we give the Dharma without reward. So I think for us, it really comes down to motivation. It really, really comes down to, am I doing more work so I can get more dana? Do I want to be more beloved by my Sangha so that I get more contributions? I mean, becomes a problem, right? So I think it is a mixture in this day and age for us who are householding teachers, right? And we've got to support ourselves somehow. My friends in Japan who have temples almost always have to do some additional job. Their donkas can't support them. And yet they've got to keep this temple up, and they've got to feed their families, and they've got to do some stuff. So, I've got friends that work for Sotoshu, I've got friends that work in the schools, or they're acupuncturists, or they do something else because they got to feed themselves, right? But I think the understanding is they're doing those things, as you were saying, as a way to support the practice, right? So one of my mentors, either when I had ordained or was about to ordain, and we're kind of talking through this, and she said, you take this step and it's a career change. Even if you're still working in the world, it's a career change, because now your focus is not on the job in the office trying to get ahead. That's not your primary thing. It might be supporting your ability to teach. It might be supporting your practice. But your focus is now not that. Your focus is this, and this is what allows you to do that. So I think if we take support that way, and we can have that kind of attitude toward it, this is the primary thing. The other things that we do support our ability to teach. We can make our peace with it. How do you feel about it as somebody who's been in robes a little less than I have?
Yeah, I think just sort of what you were saying towards the end there is how I think kind of been starting to think about it more is just that, as a priest, practice should be our primary focus, whereas, for a lay person, it may or may not be,
Yep.
It could be something that you just sort of do on the side to support your regular life, whereas I think, for us, it should be kind of the main thing. I still think that, a lot of, American or, Western Zen clergy probably doesn't even quite, and sometimes I wonder, am I even doing that, is this really my, I like to think it's my primary thing, but is it? And when I look at some other priests, it seems like maybe not. So,
But I think we have to think about, what do we mean by it's the primary thing?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't necessarily mean this is where you put all your time. You still got to work 40 hours a week to pay your rent and feed your kids. Bless you. And if you're only spending, a couple of hours, at a time in the Zendo, that's just your karmic circumstance. But I think my primary thing is my attitude, that my main job here, if you will, is to somehow share the Dharma or enable practice. Because, lay people can be very devoted lay people, but their job, if you will, is not necessarily to teach the Dharma, share the Dharma, enable practice. Their job is practice, right? Their job is practice, and then take that into the world in whatever ways lay people move through the world. Whereas for you and me and Sagan, and you, the primary thing is everything else supports my ability to share the Dharma, because that's my responsibility. If we wear these things, that means, open for business. It means whether I'm physically wearing this or not, I never stop being a Dharma teacher. And, so as I'm even moving through the world, if I'm standing in line at the post office, what am I manifesting, right? If somebody knows that I'm a Dharma teacher and they see me and I'm kind of like this, it's like, what, right? So it's like, this becomes the right livelihood because this is what there is, and then the other things enable that, right? So there's some shifting that happens. Even if I'm not wearing this, that I'm sort of not off the clock. I'm sorry. This is yours now, forever and ever. There is no there's no clocking out. Anything else people would like to say today before we move on to world peace? Good? Okay. So let's do our closing chant. We will move on to our world peace ceremony, and I will do some announcements while Mark is setting up for that. So thanks for a good discussion today, everybody, and for your practice. And away we go.